So, meta-crisis resolution via shadow integration. I'm going to play a 1-minute clip taken from the three-way conversation between Daniel, Nora, and Nate at the Norskin Foundation that really stood out to me, where Daniel explains how they've been looking at how indigenous cultures respond to sociopathic tendencies, specifically the Lakota tribe, and how when they would notice sociopathic tendencies cropping up in, say, a young person, they would do their best to try to heal that out of that individual in something that's sounds a lot like kind of like a shadow integration, Jungian shadow work sort of play. And if they couldn't, then when that child reached maturity, they would kill him. And so that's the part I'm going to kind of leave out, because I don't think that that's pragmatic in our current societal predicament. But it gives an interesting avenue with which to think about what's going on here. And so I want to explain that, what I mean by that. And so I'm going to play that clip here, and then we'll get into the weeds of it as I walk around outside Maple here in northern Vermont. So here you go.
We started doing a research project recently on what the equivalent of sociopathy and dark triad traits in indigenous cultures were. And we haven't finished, but this is something I'm very interested in. And for the most part, what we've seen so far is there was radically less of that trait because there wasn't an evolutionary niche for it. Because in a small Dunbar tribe, if you lied, everybody knew you lied. And if you fucked somebody, you were fucking the people that your life depends upon. And so in that small environment, there was just not a niche for it. The niche came later. I did talk to a Lakota scholar who said in the Lakota tribe, if a kid had the traits that they referred to as the equivalent of sociopathy, the whole tribe worked to heal it in them. And if they didn't heal it in them, at the rite of passage ceremony of puberty where they become an adult, they were killed. Because they said that if that didn't happen, those people, when they grew up, always caused war. I think so. I think there's not an even distribution of traits. There's definitely some roots of the metacrisis that live in everybody.
So there you go. There are some traits of the metacrisis that live in everybody. I agree with that. It's not an equal distribution. Some more than others than it's not static. And like he says at the beginning, in those indigenous cultures, there wasn't an environmental evolutionary niche for it. And so I feel like there's two halves to this equation. You hear Daniel talk about this a lot, that you have to think about changing the incentive landscape, because this psychopathic, sociopathic behavior is incentivized by the incentive landscape that we have now. A whale is worth however much it's worth on a boat, and it's worth nothing in our monetary system alive and well in the ocean. And so that's the system of macroeconomic incentives that incentivizes psychopathology. The other half of the equation, though, is those of us that are responding to the incentives differently, we need to stop removing ourselves from the equation. We are examples of human beings in the petri dish that are in the same incentive landscape as those that pull the whales from the ocean, that decide not to, and recognize that's not actually in my best interest. I'm going to leave the money on the table, even with the game theoretic incentivizations that exist. Why? Why don't we do that? It's a very important question. Because you can change the incentive landscape, and you should, but again, that's only one half of the equation, and actually there's very interesting avenues of entry and opportunities on the other half of the equation. And that's what I want to talk about here, is using the Lakota tribe as an example of this kind of societal shadow integration play that I want to try to talk about. If you imagine, let's say, in our current predicament, the sociopaths that are of highest consequence that are leading us off a cliff. Let's say it's an AI, or fossil fuel industry, but let's pick AI. You can pick the most consequential companies that are the most consequential. DeepMind, OpenAI, Palantir, like you can name names. You can even start naming names, like whether it's Sam Altman or forget the name of the guy that runs Palantir. But what I want to get at with this is that these are human beings, all right? They have names and addresses and kids that they drive to soccer and play squash on weekends. Like, these are human beings. It doesn't excuse necessarily the negligent behavior that they might be doing, if in fact that is negligent behavior. But we have to recognize that these people are us. They're in the same tribe of 8 billion people, even if it might not feel that way. And it's erroneous to fall into an in-group, out-group mentality, even if it seems warranted, and put them in the out-group and say, okay, we need to like outcompete these people. You're not going to outcompete Palantir. I'm sorry, but you're not. The one thing that we might have in going for us as an advantage, if anything, is that what we're advocating for really is operating more in line with reality. And that they, however much they might think that they are not operating in line with reality. That this race to the bottom of maximize finite metrics and in this goal achieving in life harming goals is not actually intelligent. It's just objectively not. It might seem that way, and there might be some temporary finite winning going on, but none of these individuals are going to find that this has been a positive use of their time. Whether it's in this life or the next, they will eventually realize, wow, I just wasted everyone else's time. That, to me, is like the elephant in the room that has high consequences. There's ramifications to that. And that if they knew that, any one of these individuals, it could be Sam Altman, it could be people that are running ExxonMobil or BP, if they knew that the way they were operating isn't in line with reality, they wouldn't be operating that way. They think they are operating in line with reality. Through any rationalization they might have, whether it's the apex predator, they're the smart man in the room, or their father taught them that, Trump's really a product of his father. Like, they think, okay, yeah, that's the smart calculus. Be the shark in the room and, kill or be killed or something. And it's an understandable frame of reference to operate from, given their background. Had you walked in their shoes growing up, maybe you'd be operating that way. And so I think what I'm proposing here is not that different than what a psychologist might do for someone in terms of trying to facilitate shadow work. Let's pick a specific example. I don't want to specifically talk about Sam Altman, although that's maybe one of the only actual names that I'm aware of currently. I can't remember the other guys. But if you were to do a research project on some specific named individual that's one of the big fish in the AI space, and say, okay, let's get to know this person. What circles do they run in? What conferences do they go to? Can we figure out maybe even what books they're reading or what sense-making they seem to operate from? Are they a humanist or a simulationist or a utilitarian? Like honestly, not manipulatively. Like, let me try to get to know this person from afar as best as I might be able to. The same way I'd be curious about getting to know my friend or a loved one. And understand why they've reached the conclusions they have and what blind spots they may have accrued, and if they fit a certain archetype of operational sense making. Maybe it's narcissism or ego, or like, how are they operating? Even in Buddhist terms here at Maple, maybe it's hungry ghost or animal phase. Like, they're operating from some relationship to reality and to others that makes sense to them. And it's going to evolve in some direction. No one operates the same sense making forever. They'll have a different operational sense making 10 years from now, whether we try to do something in terms of stewardship or not. And you could even say, okay, well, let's say it's Sam Altman, like, of all the ways that this operational sense making that we can glean that he's operating from, of all the ways it's likely to evolve into, it's likely to either go this direction in competition with the other game theoretic actors in the AI space, or it's likely to evolve this direction. It's likely to evolve one of the few directions. And the whole AI space, this multipolar trap, is going to play out one of maybe 2 or 3 ways. It's finite. Well, of all the ways it's going to play out, how might we imagine the better way it would play out, realistically speaking, and the necessary conditions to foster for that? And I'm talking on an individual level. And so what this would have to look like, really, in the nuts and bolts, if someone were like, you know what, Ben, this makes sense. Here's a blank check to do that. What would that look like? Well, you'd have to do something like some kind of a macro sandbox analysis where you actually have like AIs representing the operational sense making of all of the key players in a space. Because let's say it's the AI space, or let's say it's the fossil fuel industry. There's names and addresses for people in that space as well. And again, I'm not saying this in an aggressive way. I'm saying these are human beings. And let's say you could narrow it down to the top 30 most consequential big fish in the fossil fuel space, or pond, or egregore. And you would do deep work to try to understand the operational sense making of each one of those players and actually try to represent that in a sandbox macro projection, like a 4D chess model. And again, maps are not the terrain. Tools like that would be useful but limiting, but they are useful as long as you know that and understand to what extent they are useful. And so if you had that sandbox kind of map of the landscape of the operational sense making of these key players, and know that we are not our sense making, our bodies are hardware and our sense making is our software, and we're neither of those. We're the consciousness experiencing that. However you want to describe that seems to make the most sense. Our sense making changes throughout our lives, And it's erroneous to get too entrenched in your beliefs as though they are you. They're not. You're experiencing what it's like to have those beliefs. And so it makes the most sense to me that if I am anything at the end of the day, I'm a node of consciousness or a point of awareness, as an expression of source consciousness. You could just get deeper and deeper with that, but I try not to get too deep into it and just say, okay, yeah, I'm a point of awareness. And then just zoom out and think pragmatically about what would be the better operational sense making to operate from. And I'll just do that. So don't make too big a deal of it. And then for others as well, like let me understand psychology and sense making and shadow integration to see what's the best way this plays out and the necessary conditions to foster for it to play out that way. Because again, this Ubuntu, I am because we're part of a macroorganism. We in turn form everyone else's sense making anyway. I'm the product of other people's choices. You're the product of other people's choices. Other people are the product of our choices. How can we do a productive, honest, dutiful, responsible role within that? And so, yeah, you'd have to have a sandbox macro projection and actually see how to do that. And the other thing I'd love to throw into this is no matter what civic approach a person applies to the meta crisis, whether they want to preserve biodiversity or they want to do something like this, or you re-engineer Cambridge Analytica for sense-making stewardship, it doesn't matter what it is. You're doing something to try to positively affect the world. You could zoom out another layer of abstraction and recognize that ultimately that is just optimizing for certain metrics on some finite time scale, and will have some degree of success depending on what strategy you implemented, and will play out however it plays out. Doesn't mean it's meaningless, but yeah, you could categorize it that way. Well, why? Why do we want the human civilization to go on longer than it otherwise would? It's not going to go on indefinitely, is it? Even if it does, like, why? Like, you need a strong why. Otherwise, it's going to affect the efficacy of what you do, and it's something to consider. It has consequences. And so the why that I want to propose here, that I've been floating on lately, is however one thinks about this is just in my language, you could use different words, is that it comes back to the edification of people's souls. Regular people, Sam Altman's, every human being on the planet, it comes back to the edification of our souls. And what I mean by that is whatever we're in store for over the next 20 years, I don't know exactly, but it seems like it's going to be rocky. No one gets out of this alive. No one will be alive a century from now. And so in the navigating of this time period, what's the best realistic way in which we could operate and navigate it that would be edifying? In terms of becoming more resilient, learning how to collaborate and cohere with others, learning how to live off the land or homestead maybe is your bag, or maybe it's learning game theoretic dynamics or how to take care of you and yours. It really is a case-by-case basis, but that's really what it is. How do I overcome this shadow that I'm dealing with? How do I collaborate with other civic actors? How do I steward my local ecosystem? How do I take better care of my environment? These are things that I think are well beyond the human context. This is just dealing with other sentient actors. And so what I'm saying is, if there happens to be any continued experience beyond this life, aside from what that might be, you now have every reason to want to get good at existing if you've got no choice but to exist. That's as simple as it'll ever get, I think. And so getting good at existing has answers, like the golden rule and just becoming a more omnipositive actor in your environment, like prioritizing the well-being of the whole instead of yourself at the expense of the whole. These things are soul edifying. And the better you do that and operate from that place of edifying people's souls instead of prioritizing finite metrics, the better we're going to do. And so it's something that transcends all of this. Because again, all of this will play out however it plays out. Why get things to go on longer than they otherwise would? Well, if you're trying to edify people's souls, and if we're all expressions of the same source of consciousness, we're all neurons in the same brain, maybe, at least in principle. I like to think of us as we're all another eyeball of the same macroorganism, You've got two eyes, but there's not two yous, And again, we're more of a macroorganism than we realize. We're not individuals or islands into ourselves. And yet we're both. We're an individual and a community. And so that's why, because we're both an individual and a community, it makes sense to, yes, try to change the incentive landscape as a whole, but also see if you can find avenues of entry and opportunities to change individuals. And not change them like engineering wise or manipulative. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things like David McRaney's How Minds Change, understanding the organic ways in which people do change their minds on very key issues. People that have gone from thinking climate change is a hoax to thinking, you know what, I'd like to actually take care of my environment. That seems like a good idea. How do they arrive at that conclusion? Because it didn't happen in a vacuum. There is something they ran into. They were operating from some archetypal sense-making framework, and they ran into something. Maybe it was a book or something somebody said, or a conference, and they were like, you know what, that makes sense. I'm going to look into this. I'm going to get curious. Well, you can tee that up. You can tee that up for people. And so to finish with what I say all the time is that good framing for our time is that we have the power of gods with AI and nuclear weapons, but we need the love and wisdom of gods to be the better stewards of that power. Until we do that, then we're going to probably destroy ourselves with that power. And so if you operate from that analogy and take it the next step further and say, okay, well, what might be the natural actions as a result of the love and wisdom of God, if we just stay in that analogy, you can recognize that, yeah, you know what? If the problem is erroneous sense-making and an erroneous relationship to reality, the natural action as a result of the love and wisdom of God's would be to figure out how to tee up the best program or on-ramp for somebody, tailored to them, knowing them well enough to do so, that might vector them in a positive direction that's in their best interest, and doing it for the edification of their soul, not in a manipulative capacity to compete with them for something. Recognizing it's actually in their best interest. Because I think that's what it all comes back to, is no matter how you skin this multipolar trap, when you go back to the beginning of this multipolar trap in one narrative, to the beginning of the agricultural revolution, where the first person that developed the plow was like, oh, you know what? I get a certain competitive advantage by having this technological advantage over, nature, and strapping this plow to a cow, which is not even they hadn't even domesticated those animals yet. So it seemed it was a strange thing to do. They had to psychopathologize in order to do that. And so that was the first time you could think, although you could make a case for earlier, where somebody had a more erroneous relationship to reality by strapping this plow to a cow, and then in turn got a competitive advantage over the animistic cultures that didn't do that. The thing is, which do you think would change what they did? If the animistic cultures that got outcompeted got to redo everything, do you think they would change what they did? I don't think so. And those that had developed the plow that gave them the game theoretic advantage over the animistic cultures and outcompeted them, do you think they would change what they did? I think of course they would. Because by every metric, those that get these game theoretic advantages, that win these finite games, which again, what are they winning actually? Is there any finish line to this where these people are winning? It seems like a cancer cell. The cancer cell doesn't win, it dies when the body dies. And so I think that those who got these game theoretic advantages at the expense of a more erroneous relationship to reality wouldn't have done that. They'd be like, you know what? It wasn't worth the trade-off, man. It wasn't worth all the misery that I bought myself by being more negligent with my environment and strapping plows to cows, which doesn't make any fucking sense. And you can make a case to that to people, whether it's Ubuntu or I'm an emergent property of the whole, or recognizing the bad symbiotics and ontology of I'm an individual island unto myself, which doesn't make any sense logistically speaking. Whatever it is, the right approach, or it's psilocybin trip, or being in the community of practice, like you can find what that would be given their archetypal operational sense making. And that's the play that we need to do. You actually need to recognize the inevitable, unescapable complexity of these issues and get in the weeds and get in the mud and say, okay, this larger multipolar trap of the AI space that will play out however it does, one of a few different directions it will play out. It's not infinite. It'll play out this way, or this way. Of the three ways it's likely to play out, how might it play out net positive for everyone, comparatively speaking, as realistically as we could be expected to? And how do we foster the conditions for that? By zeroing in on the individuals in that space, because it's made up of individuals. You could narrow it down to the 20 individuals and say, what avenues of entry exist for us to make a great case to them? Maybe not, cold calling them with a consultancy, but just see, can we give ourselves a lot of open imagine that they might organically come to the conclusion, you know what? As much as I might be winning in this scenario, this isn't fulfilling and it's not in line with reality, and I'll have wasted my time. So I'm going to find a way that's actually net positive and do something like the CRIs of the world and try to get this whole situation to play out positive, realistically speaking. And so be not that different than the way the FBI converts con men and turns criminals into colleagues. There's ways of doing that. You have to understand the psychology of it and do that shadow work. So that's my proposition as a more deep, nuanced way to think of a meta-crisis resolution via shadow integration. So thank you very much, and let me know what you think in the comments. And I'll probably do a group Zoom at some point to talk about this stuff and see what people are thinking as a result. So thanks a lot, and talk to you later.